With Halloween right around the corner, I thought there wouldn't be a better time than now to talk a bit about some of the most interesting and perhaps gruesome horror manga that I've ever read. It's difficult for me to truly call this a recommendation video, as the content of much of these manga is extremely graphic and not necessarily something I think everyone should read, but for the few of us out there that have an extremely morbid curiosity about life, these manga depict perhaps some of the darkest aspects of the human mind. Let's start with Sagawa's manga, a memoir written by Issei Sagawa, otherwise known as the Kobe Cannibal. This manga was released in December of 2000, it's 1 volume long and 4 chapters. Now for those unaware, this is an autobiography of an otherwise infamous crime perpetrated by Sagawa in June of 1981. Essentially, while he was in Paris pursuing his PhD in literature, he lured a Dutch classmate, Renee Hartevelt, into his apartment where he murdered and proceeded to cannibalize her. He was eventually found out, though he was deemed mentally unstable, and after spending some time in and out of mental hospitals, he was ultimately released in 1986, where he spent the rest of his life as a free man. Now, there's a lot more nuance to the case than that, and Sagawa goes into some detail with it from his perspective. However, from the outside looking in, it's important to understand that Sagawa was the son of a very wealthy family, and it's basically the consensus of the legal community and those that are familiar with the case that the judges were bought off, the juries were bought off, and he was essentially bought his freedom. Now, as you might infer, Sagawa isn't exactly a mangaka, so the presentation of this manga is very crude and amateurish. The images are otherwise flat, lacking detail, and almost childlike. The paneling is nothing to look twice at, and in fact, sometimes it can make the manga difficult to read on a technical level. However, despite all this, the manga is still able to invoke a really strong, visceral reaction, and that largely comes by way of his descriptions of the crime, specifically the act of cannibalism. These descriptions are extremely graphic, right? He goes into extreme detail about the taste and texture of the meat, the various ways he tried to prepare and cook it. Remarks about how fatty it is, that the muscles kind of taste like veal, or there's parts of the thigh that are sweet as tuna belly. I think on the surface, anyone reading this manga who was unaware of its backstory might read some of these descriptions and laugh at them, thinking that they're an easy way for the mangaka to create a vivid image in the reader's mind of an otherwise foreign or perhaps mythical experience. However, knowing that all of this is real makes it so much more heavy. And perhaps the eeriest part of all of this is that he doesn't seem to think or care much about the crime itself. I mean, just as much of the book is focused on other aspects of his life. And oftentimes he's even painting himself as the victim. To quote Manga Crash, it's really a footnote on his life, something that happened one night. And still he's fully enjoying life. He has a sense of humor about this. The way he speaks about the event and parades it like a badge of honor is perhaps the most disgusting part of this book. Talk about a total disrespect and disregard of the victim's family. Interestingly, this manga was actually published in English by Serial Pleasures Publishing, who publishes a lot of serial killer memorabilia, merchandise, other really disgusting things. And in keeping with this disgusting nature, this edition of the book includes an interview with Sagawa, a kind of written memoir from him, and perhaps most gruesome, photos from the crime. Again, I don't know to what extent I can recommend this, but as an object of study, something that represents the most sick and twisted aspects of civilization, it is something worth considering. The next manga I want to talk about is Foreign Bodies by Shintaro Kago. This manga was serialized in Axe magazine starting on April 30th, 2012, and ran for about 29 chapters, which were then collected into a single volume. Now, for the uninitiated, this is a work of Uroguro nonsensu, otherwise known as erotic, grotesque nonsense. And really, Shintaro Kago is like the Junji Ito of Uroguro. He has published very seminal and popular works in the genre, including Fracture or Dementia 21, but has a massive backlog of other short story collections and important tales in the genre. Now, before I discuss the content of this collection, I think it's important to understand what Uroguro is all about. Now, from a contemporary perspective, it's easy to write off many works as empty shock value. But it's important to understand that the history of Uroguro is rooted in political rebellion. It emerged in the early 20th century Japan in opposition to Showa-era values. There was a lot of legislation at the time against quote, morally obscene and politically extreme content, which was essentially their way of silencing their political opponents, as they would kind of label these more progressive values that were emerging at the time as morally obscene and politically extreme. And this sort of legislation would allow them to take action against that. However, Uroguro developed as a form of rebellion against that kind of stifling of progressive values. It would openly depict sexuality in its most extreme form. A lot of these early stories would focus on what they call the modern girl, a sort of Japanese woman with more independence, more freedom than what the Showa-era ideal of the perfect girl might allow. Now, it's not to say that there isn't shock value slop within the genre, nor is it necessarily a paragon of progressive values, but it's important to recognize that there is something more substantial beneath the surface that deserves our attention, and it's not all just empty shock slop. And I think a great example of that is actually in this volume, in the 5th chapter called The Prison Guard. So the story follows a prison guard whose duty often involves carrying out capital punishment. And the typical means of this is to press a button that releases a trapdoor, resulting in the prisoner being hung. However, there are 3 buttons with 3 guards pushing them at the same time. The idea then is that by dividing the act across multiple people, no single guard bears the full weight of moral responsibility. And this is a fairly common practice. This is something we see across the globe with respect to capital punishment. It's so that any one individual doesn't feel the full weight of what I would say is an immoral act. Oftentimes, 2 of the 3 buttons will be faulty, but because they all press it at the same time, they're not aware of which ones are. They don't know which button was the true kill switch, you might say. However, the genius of this story is how it goes on to depict the guard and 2 doppelgangers perpetrating other crimes such as vandalism and abuse. These examples are really great at emphasizing that even if the responsibility of the act is split up, that does not undermine the fact that something immoral did happen and that all 3 individuals played a part in bringing that about. So we get literally a scene of the 3 doppelgangers spray painting a mural or something, doing some kind of profane graffiti. And it just demonstrates that even if the individual act and the responsibility behind it is split up, that doesn't take away from the fact that they are doing something wrong. And I think the next example in the manga paints that picture much more vividly, but for the sake of adhering to YouTube's content policy, I will refrain from mentioning it, and I caution anyone who wants to read onwards to figure out what I might be talking about. Again, it's Uroguro, it's erotic, it's grotesque, and in this instance, the latter is emphasized to the nth degree. So be warned, much like a lot of Uroguro, it's not something that is widely understood, it's not something that is widely appealing. But as I mentioned, there's something more substantial at play that, if you're willing to give it the time, it will offer you a pretty big payout. The last manga I want to talk about is Itai Desu, or It is Painful, I believe, by Nori Ochazuki. This manga was serialized in Comic Essay Gekijo, which is a josei magazine, on October 5th, 2012. And like the other manga we talked about today, it's a single volume broken up into 23 chapters. The premise is simple. It's a collection of 22 short stories, each detailing a painful experience. They're supposedly ordered according to the severity of the pain, following the 6-point verbal rating scale. So these range from more common experiences like paper cuts to more niche and painful, such as spilling boiling soup into a boot. Now, the idea of a manga showcasing a series of painful events is interesting in theory. The benefits that, especially with these more familiar stories, the mangaka can draw upon the reader's own experiences to create a visceral reaction. After all, who hasn't felt the sting of a paper cut? And so that's what Ochazuki is banking on for many of these stories. The moment you see a character's finger graze a sheet of paper and hear the ensuing shriek, you're reminded of your own experience and may even relive the sensation yourself. So in this regard, the manga can be extremely engaging, pulling the reader through a series of shared pains alongside its characters. Unfortunately, the execution does suffer from several major flaws. First and foremost, each chapter exists solely to depict the painful event, leaving some chapters as short as 3 pages. So as a result, characters are kind of just mediums for the painful events, almost serving as self-inserts for the reader. Now, I don't personally take issue with this style of storytelling, though it does become clear that the success of these stories is contingent on how well the author conveys the sensation of pain. So consider chapter 20. A ramen shop owner drops a pot of boiling soup into his rubber boot, burning his skin. Because the situation is so specific, it lacks the immediacy and force of a more universal pain. Now, this could be redeemed by a more detailed art style that visually depicts the severity of the burn. For those of you who are familiar with Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, he has a whole section talking about the level of detail in art and the type of effect that has on the reader. Now, something more abstract and cartoony, the benefit of that is it's more of a blank canvas, and it better facilitates the reader's projection of themselves and their life experiences onto what they read. However, on the other end of the spectrum, a more detailed art style is really good at emphasizing the physicality of what's being read. Now, it does emphasize the sort of difference between the reader and what is being read, but again, in terms of conveying something physically or emphasizing its physicality, that detailed art style is best. And I think that this manga could have better utilized that distinction better. Where each character is sort of a self-insert for the reader, I think the cartoony style does work there, but he carries forward that same style when depicting the really painful experiences. And so, if we can't relate to those experiences, the physicality is already lost in the art style, and so we're not really left with a whole lot to sink our teeth into. Which is a shame, because really, if he was able to kind of put more resources into the panels that depict these events and their consequences, then even if they're not immediately relatable, we might have been able to take away more from that chapter. But again, with something niche like chapter 20, as I just described, not so lucky. Another major flaw lies in the scaling of pain across episodes. So for example, the first chapter depicts a woman cutting her nail too short and stubbing her toe, right? I mean, a pretty common experience, decently painful, but, is it the most painful thing in the universe? No, not particularly. But then, by the 21st chapter, once again, we're kind of getting a depiction of a lady cutting her fingertips off. I would say that is more painful than stubbing your toe. But I'm not so convinced that this is the most painful thing ever, right? In terms of scaling, this is the second last chapter or third last chapter. And I'm just not convinced that this would be a 6 on the verbal pain scale or whatever, right? The difference in severity between these two episodes doesn't accurately reflect the difference between a 1 and a 6 on the verbal rating scale. And so we can see that Ochazuki struggles to imagine experiences that really capture the worst pain possible. His attempts result in overly contrived examples that, again, lose the reader on the level of relatability, and the simplified art style farther limits his ability to convey the intensity of these events. Finally, I must say, the novelty of the manga wears thin rather quickly. Nothing happens in each chapter other than the painful event. So if you can't relate to the event, if you've never experienced this or it's not something that affects you in any way, then the invocation of this pain is not going to do anything for you. And outside of that, the manga is extremely stale. Right? Characters are lifeless, environments are totally unexplored, there's no real sense of narrative development. So it might seem like I've just spent the last 5 minutes ragging on this manga, and I kinda did, but I still think that for some of the more basic pains that it depicts, and for the kind of philosophy behind depicting it, the idea of that shared experience between the characters and the reader, right? The invocation of a familiar pain. I think in those stories, it is quite effective. For that reason alone, it's worth reading. And as I previously mentioned, most chapters are quite short, so it's not like this is a huge time sink. So perhaps I would say that this is one manga I could comfortably recommend, especially compared to the last two. So that wraps up this manga spotlight. Again, not so sure I could call this a recommendation video given the content of some of these manga, but I wanted to take a moment to discuss some of the most gruesome and horrifying manga I've read, especially in light of the oncoming spooky season. Thanks for listening, my name is Doofy, and don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.